We're thinking about an offering and discernment today. Welcome. We're taking another look into the life and message of Elisabeth Elliot, who called us to live to a higher standard each day and not be satisfied with just a little empty religion in our lives as a shallow substitute for giving God our best. Our series continues in the coming weeks as we hear from family, friends, and others who were influenced by Elisabeth's life and message. Hey, it's good to have you with us today. Well, today we wrap up our short series called The Highest Form of Service as we think about an offering like nobody else's, and maturity, the power to discern. We'll be hearing from Elisabeth Martin, one of the granddaughters of Elisabeth Elliot, as she talks about her earliest memories of her grandmother. And as we're thinking about discernment, among other things today, we'll hear from a listener who appreciates the idea that Elisabeth shared of doing the next thing, and some thoughts on marriage that she learned from Elisabeth, about laughing hard and peace instead of worry. That coming later. First, though, let's get to part 3 of our 4-part look at the highest form of service. Have you ever thought of yourself as having an offering that you could give that is like no one else's offering? That no one can do your work as well as you? About how everything becomes material for sacrifice, and about the highest form of worship.
You are loved with an everlasting love. That's what the Bible says, and underneath are the everlasting arms. This is your friend, Elisabeth Elliot, talking with you about an offering like nobody else's. Whose offering do you think I mean? Yours. You have an offering like nobody else's. You have a way to worship God that nobody else can do, because God has made you a unique individual. James McConkie has said this: "You are unique. You have no double, no two jewels, no two stars, and no two lives are alike. Every life is a fresh thought from God to the world, and there is no person in all the world who can do your work as well as you." Do you doubt that? To me, once a Christian has committed his life, his body, all that he is, all that he has, all that he does, and all that he suffers to Jesus Christ, then, quite literally, everything becomes material for sacrifice. That living sacrifice is a continuous offering. And it is an offering like nobody else's, because there isn't anyone who has exactly the same combination of what I am, what I have, what I do, and what I suffer. That's what I mean. All of our lives are meant to be offered to Him with thanksgiving. It's a form of worship. It's the highest form of worship. Daily obedience. You and I have got to stop allowing the world to establish our judgments of what constitutes happiness, success, worldliness, Christian service. When's the last time you had a chance to just get away by yourself, sit down, and think, what constitutes happiness? What is your idea of success? Is what you're doing really the thing that God made you to do? Are you going to hear Him say someday, "Well done, good and faithful servant"? I have a niece who was making an enormous amount of money working in a computer business, and she made the choice to give up that money and that position and to go back to school to get a degree, which she felt was important in God's purpose for her. And when I asked her why she did it, she said, "Well, because I didn't want to get to the end of my life and only be able to say, 'I sure made a lot of money.'" Do you take your cues from the world about what constitutes happiness and success and Christian service? The world, don't forget, may be your particular corner of the Christian world. Just as subtle a snare, perhaps even more subtle a snare, than the world as referring to the non-Christian world. Sometimes we envy another man's place in the body of Christ. Other times we disdain somebody's place. We think one man is doing the great thing, and we fail to see how another can possibly be of any use in what we call the Lord's service. I remember hearing a missionary one time say, "We're here to serve the Lord. I don't know what you're here for." It's understandable that the eye might feel like saying to the hand, "I don't need you," but the eye's failure to perceive the usefulness of the hand proves nothing at all. Paul gave us the most obvious illustration he could think of. Yet we persist in setting up our own hierarchy of values, lionizing one for the mere performance of his duty, and degrading another because his is not really important. Or to put it more graphically, we praise the eye because it can see, and we condemn the hand because it cannot see. Now, does that make sense? Honestly now, does that make sense? The eye was not made to do what the hand does. The hand was not made to see. Need I belabor the point any further? In Romans 12, 6-8, we read, "The gifts that we possess are allotted to us by God's grace and must be exercised accordingly. The gift of inspired utterance, for example, in proportion to a man's faith, or the gift of administration in administration. If you are helping others in distress, do it cheerfully." I confess that I've often envied other people's gifts. My job is writing and speaking, and I know a great many people who can write far better than I can, and who can speak far better than I can. And I'm tempted to tax God with my complaints and say, "Lord, couldn't you have given me the brains of C.S. Lewis, or of Madeleine L'Engle, or of George Herbert?" And of course the Lord comes back with a very simple answer, "Yes, I could have given you the brains of C.S. Lewis or Madeleine L'Engle or George Herbert, but it wasn't the job of Lewis and L'Engle and Herbert that I wanted you to do. I have given you the gifts which are appropriate to the job I want you to do." Is anyone that I'm talking to today feeling quite wistful and disappointed, perhaps, because he or she is not in the place where they feel that they could use the gifts that God has given them? Is there anyone there who feels that the gifts have never been recognized by anybody else, and so your hands are tied? Is there anyone who feels that the gifts are not appropriate to the job that he or she has to do? You can be assured that the God who organizes and orchestrates and harmonizes all the world and all the people in the world knows exactly what you need for the job that he wants you to do. He knows what you need for fulfillment of his purpose. Let me read again from this quotation by James H. McConkie. "God shapes and orders your life so as to bring you into contact with the very circle in which your personality can touch others in the world. Just a hair's breadth of shift in the focus of the telescope, and some man sees a vision of beauty which before had been all confused and befogged. So, too, just that grain of individual and personal variation in your life from every other man's, and someone sees Jesus Christ with a clearness and beauty that he would discern nowhere else. In you there is just a trifle of variation in the mingling of the spices, to use another metaphor, and behold, someone becomes conscious of the fragrance of Christ. You have an offering like nobody else's. We are to use our gifts, the Scripture tells us, intelligently, decently, in order, and cheerfully. What is God's purpose? That there may be unity, mature manhood, measured by nothing less than the measure of the stature of the fullness of Christ. Let me read to you again from St. Paul. I've read passages about gifts from Romans and from 1 Corinthians. You'll think that Paul repeated himself. Well, he certainly did, because this is an important thing that he wanted us to get through our heads. In Ephesians 4, he says, "These were his gifts, some to be apostles, some prophets, some evangelists, some pastors and teachers, to equip God's people for work in his service, to the building up of the body of Christ. So shall we all at last attain to the unity inherent in our faith and our knowledge of the Son of God, to mature manhood, measured by nothing less than the full stature of Christ." You know, some of the people who have had the deepest, most lasting influence in my life have not been apostles, prophets, evangelists, pastors, or teachers, but very simple, humble, unsung people who, in the most godly and gracious way, performed the humble tasks that God had given to them. I could name many. I've told you, I think, about Mrs. Kershaw, the little old deaf lady who used to work for my mother. She was a godsend in our home. She couldn't hear a thing, except if you shouted into a little microphone that she wore pinned to the front of her dress. Yet she washed dishes, she made brown sugar cookies, she made gallons upon gallons of applesauce. She sat by the hour and talked with my poor invalid grandmother and cheered her day. Never once did I hear Mrs. Kershaw complain. I think of her as a true mother in Israel. She mothered us kids. She was a friend to my mother. In between her tasks, she would sit down and pray for each member of our family. That was a gift. She was a gift. Maybe you haven't been able to discern any specific gift that God has given to you, but I believe that eternity may show that you yourself have been a gift to somebody. And this contributes to our all attaining to mature manhood, measured by nothing less than the full stature of Christ. Adulthood is the willingness to lay down our lives. The measure of our self-giving is the measure of our maturity. We are no longer to be children, says Paul, tossed by the waves and whirled about by every fresh gust of teaching. Let us speak the truth in love, so shall we fully grow up into Christ. You have an offering like nobody else's.
That was The Highest Form of Service, Part 3, an offering like nobody else's. We'll be back with the conclusion of our short series, The Highest Form of Service, in a little bit. First, though, we hear from Elisabeth Martin. Elisabeth is one of the granddaughters of Elisabeth Elliot. She took time recently in a Zoom call to share some of her earliest memories of her granny.
She came to help my mom with the rest of us. So I think I was probably 4.5 when my sister, who was born just after me, was born, and she came to help around the house. I remember her squeezing out a wash rag. She called it a wash rag for doing the dishes. I remember her wiping counters very thoroughly. I remember her keeping everything as ordered as possible, but then also being very tired and telling my mom when my mom got back from the hospital, "I don't know how you do it, Val. I don't know how you do it." She had a great appreciation for how hard my mom worked all the time and how there was never a dull moment. I was always laundry to do and dishes to do, and little people can be very demanding, but she told the most wonderful stories. She had an otter puppet that we all loved that she would bring in her suitcase each time. She wouldn't leave it with us. She would bring it. It was her puppet that she told stories with, and she would hold it in her, I think in her right hand. She would have her hand in the puppet, but that puppet came alive. And we didn't think of it as a puppet. It was the otter, and she would do otter stories with the puppet. I remember her having tiny surprises for us when she came because she never brought much luggage. It was always one very small carry-on suitcase that she packed everything in. She was a minimalist when it came to her wardrobe. She wore good quality clothes, but she did not have a lot of them, and she didn't want a lot of them. I think that kept her decision-making for all the travel she did. I think it kept the decision-making very simple. But I remember her bringing tiny surprises, and she would always say, "Close your eyes and hold out your hands." And then she would have a small, either a Hershey Kiss or a little tiny stone creature that she'd found, or a tiny little handmade something that somebody had sent to her that she wanted to share with us. And I remember her loving little people. She had a real gift with little children. She would love to tell them stories, and she loved to have them sit on her lap. She would squeeze us, not uncomfortably tight, but she would squeeze us, and she would always take a big sigh as she just loved her grandchildren. So we were very much beloved by her, and whenever she gave us presents, it was always something that either was very useful or very special, like a very nice hardback copy of a classic book that she thought we should read. I remember her reading out loud, and I remember her telling stories and poems. She loved to read poems to us, and I think I got the love of poetry from her and from my mom, because she had such a gift for reading a poem in a way that didn't make it feel like a poem. So you would read the stanza in normal speech, not just stopping line by line by line, but you'd read the thought, the complete thought. And she taught me how to do that. But yeah, those are some of my early memories.
Elisabeth Martin, who joined us by Zoom not too long ago. We thank her for taking time to share some of her memories. Later on, we heard from a listener who talked about the power to discern if you have the gift of singleness. That coming up later. First, though, it's the highest form of service, part 4, maturity, the power to discern. You know, it's been said every parent knows that he has one overriding job, bringing a child to maturity, guiding them in learning to make decisions for themselves. Maturity involves knowing that you don't know everything, or even as much as you thought you did.
One of the jobs that every parent knows that he or she has is to bring the child to maturity. All the training is directed toward that. It's not that you are going to force your way upon your children for the rest of their lives. It's that you want to guide them in learning to make decisions for themselves. You want to establish a firm foundation of truth, of principles on which future decisions are to be made. And as they grow toward maturity, they have to learn to make those decisions. I can remember my parents agonizing over the points at which they had to allow us to make our own decisions. We had been brought up to early teenage on the principles, and they had made decisions for us. But then as we began to move into teenage years, gradually they had to take hands off and remind us again of the principles on which we had been raised, and ask us to face our decisions before God. And that's always a very painful thing for a parent, to cut the apron strings, to see the child going off by himself. I remember the chills that went up my spine when I first saw my daughter driving out the driveway in our brand new Chrysler when she had only had her license about 1 month. Just that was a big watershed for me to cross. She was now a driver, a licensed driver, and the only car available, of course, was our car, which happened to be a new one. Maturity. It's a painful stage. It's painful to get there. It's painful for parents to see their children arrive at the threshold of maturity and then to let them go. It must be painful for God to watch us, His children, growing into maturity and waiting in patience and long-suffering as we make mistakes and forget the principles that He has already taught us and fail to make decisions on the right basis. One definition of maturity is the power to discern, and it takes a personal relationship with God, growing and walking with Him in order to give us this power. My friend Van, whose real name is Eleanor Vandevort, went to Africa as a missionary. She worked for 13 years in the southern Sudan with a tribe called Nuers, N-U-E-R. And then she was kicked out by the Arab government because she had been working on the translation of a language which was now illegal. And when she was kicked out, she came to visit me in the jungle of Ecuador. I had been in Ecuador for nearly 11 years at that time, and so we had a great many things to discuss. We had known each other as college students, had not seen each other since. We had both been working on languages. She had lost 13 years' worth of work, humanly speaking, because it was no longer legal to print, write, or teach in the Nuer language. And I had lost the work on 2 different languages for various reasons. And so we began to talk about the mysteries of serving God. And I remember Van saying to me as we sat there in my living room in a very civilized house that Jim Elliot had built, we sat there and looked out over the Atung Yaku, which is one of the headwaters of the Amazon. And Van said to me, "You know, Bet, things were simple before I went to Africa." I said, "What do you mean?" She said, "I knew what a missionary's job was, and I knew exactly what godless people were supposed to be like. And I went out there thinking that I knew the Nuers and knew my job and knew exactly what was going to happen. But as soon as I got to know the individuals," and she told me about some of those individuals. One of them was named Toot, another one was named Gaj, and another one was named Yol. She said, as I got to know individuals, my categories began to crumble. I realized that I didn't know as much as I knew before. Well, she was in a better state then, wasn't she? Because as Socrates said, the man who doesn't know and doesn't know that he doesn't know is in a very bad state. But the man who doesn't know and knows that he doesn't know is in not nearly so bad a state. So part of maturity is learning that you don't know as much as you thought you did. Someone else has said beginning to think is beginning to be undermined. If we make people think they're thinking, they'll love us. If we make people think, they're likely to hate us. Now, if everything is very simple and black and white, and we've got everything nailed down neatly as to how the Christian life is supposed to work and what missionary work is all about and one thing and another, then we see Christian virtues in Christian people, and we see the works of the flesh in non-Christians. What happens when all of a sudden you see the works of the flesh being very obvious in Christians, and you begin to see Christian virtues in non-Christians? Your categories begin to be broken up, don't they? God has all kinds of ways of shaking our mountain refuge. Does the breakdown of a Christian break down your faith? Some of us have certainly been tempted to have our faith shaken when we hear some of the sad stories of public figures who have fallen into moral breakdowns. And yet, as mature Christians, we are not at liberty to reject the facts. These things are true. These things have happened. And so the facts drive us again to the acknowledgement of mystery, of God's saving responsibility. Where does our faith rest? On Christ, the pioneer and perfecter of faith. Do you know all the answers? Has God given you an answer to your whys? Well, he certainly hasn't given me an answer. He says, trust me. And I have to acknowledge I don't know all the answers. I can't know them. But I can learn to know Christ. I can walk with him and talk with him and ask him to speak to me and lead me in the way everlasting. Lead me in paths of righteousness for his name's sake. Who are the mature? Well, according to Hebrews 5:14, we read that they are those who have their faculties trained by practice. It isn't a rule book that God has given us. It's a book of principles. A rule book doesn't call for discernment. If the child spills his milk and gets a spanking, he's being trained. It's not principles that he's concerned with at that time. It doesn't take any mature discernment for the child to learn the second time that if he spills his milk on purpose, I'm talking about throwing your milk on the floor. I'm not talking about a 2-year-old's childish accident. We spill milk too, don't we, sometimes? But when a child does something deliberately bad, then he deserves a spanking. That's not mature discernment. That's just a conditioned reflex, like the monkey who is taught to pull a certain rope in order to get a banana. These are not signs of a mature mind. But the parent's job is to teach Johnny to think, to discern, to make his choices, to bring children to adulthood. A servant is trained for a job. A son is trained for life. When God gave the 10 Commandments, they contained the seeds of all the moral law. But it was not the last word. When Jesus preached the Sermon on the Mount, he expanded on those commandments. He showed that the letter killed, but the Spirit gives life. The 10 Commandments say, "Thou shalt not murder." But Jesus made that commandment infinitely broader when he said, anyone who hates his brother is a murderer. Jesus didn't come to abolish the law, but to fulfill it. We can be in a quandary about many things. Sometimes we think, if only God had given us a rule book and a doctrine book, he would have eliminated the loopholes and the schisms and the false teaching and the squabbling and the perplexity which has plagued the church for all these centuries. Well, yes, he might have, but at the same time, he might have produced a crop of spiritual dwarfs. It's God's purpose to shape us to the likeness of his Son. This is the true good referred to in Romans 8:28. Everything that happens fits into a pattern for good. But that pattern and that purpose is to shape us to the likeness of his Son. Maturity is the power to discern. Maturity is the right sort of independence. And here's a hymn which I think defines something of the maturity that we're talking about here. Frederick W. Faber's, "For the love of God is broader than the measure of man's mind, and the heart of the eternal is most wonderfully kind. But we make his love too narrow by false limits of our own, and we magnify its strictness with a zeal he will not own." It's not conformity to a static code, but relationship with the person of Christ himself that brings us to maturity.
The highest form of service, Part 4. Maturity, the power to discern. Well, before we go, we had a chance to catch up with a listener who appreciates the discernment that Elisabeth Elliot showed and her thoughts about the gift of singleness.
Hello, my name's Cecilia. I'm 22 years old, and I'm from San Diego, California. I've been listening to Elisabeth Elliot for about a year now, and God's been using her words to make me the godly woman that he's called me to be. I've never really had a spiritual mother, so having her writings and recordings of her sermons, it's just been wonderful having an elder godly woman to guide me through life. I love how she describes God's will as simply doing the next thing. That's all there is to life, just doing what you've been called to do wherever God has you. And at the time when I came across this podcast, I was wrestling with the idea of marriage, especially as a young woman in marriageable age. There were Christian guys in my church, but I hadn't come across a godly man that I could potentially see as being my husband. And I began to wonder if I ever would. It was not in my plan for my life to be single at 21 without any hopes on the horizon, but it seemed God's plan for me at 21 was to be single, and still is now, actually. After I heard Elisabeth Elliot talk about how she waited 5 years for Jim Elliot, suddenly I realized maybe I'm okay. On one talk, though, she said a young woman came up to her and asked her, "How do I know?" Oh well, she did her teenage voice. "Well, like, Miss Elliot, how do I know that I have the gift of singleness?" And Elisabeth Elliot replied, "Well, are you single?" The young woman responded, "Yes." "Well, then you have the gift of singleness." I laughed so hard when I heard this because I realized that was the answer to my worries. And I was that young girl, like that was me, yeah, was me. And it just brought me so much peace. And sometimes if I ever have like that little bit of worry creep up on me, I just remember that and it just brings me such peace and gives me a good chuckle. And I don't know what God has in store for me, and I don't need to know. He's got the whole world in his hands, and all I need to focus on is what he has for me today. And that's just one of the many ways that Elisabeth Elliot has impacted my life. Thank you.
Well, thank you, Cecilia. Well, our time is coming to an end. Thanks for letting us come into your home, your office, maybe along with you as you took a walk, wherever we found you. On behalf of the Elisabeth Elliot Foundation, in cooperation with the Bible Broadcasting Network, let me invite you to check out all the resources at elisabethelliot.org. That includes devotionals, videos, more Gateway to Joy programs, and other resources. Maybe you'd like to leave a comment too. Go to elisabethelliot.org, go to the podcast section, and we invite you to share a message. Well, until next time, may God remind you each day, you are loved with an everlasting love. And underneath are what? Yeah, underneath are the everlasting arms